Hello and welcome to The Things That Don't Change, where we endeavor to view an ever-changing and ever-fluid world through the lens of eternity. Welcome everybody, Chris here, and we're doing something a bit different today. So we didn't get to get together and record a normal episode, so we're giving you a bit of a sneak peek special, so to speak. For those of you, of course, who have been listening to us, you know that we have a locals at tttdc.locals.com. That's Tango 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 Delta Charlie.locals.com. And on there, we like to kind of do some, different side videos and things like that. Tommy will do like a weekly morning prayer. Patrick's done a couple of videos on like business ethics from a Catholic perspective. Also, how you navigate the job search as a Catholic. And then what I do is a weekly Saints of the Week, where I'll go through the upcoming week, all the saints who are on the calendar for that week, and just kind of give a little background about each of them, just to keep us all aware, keep myself aware of who are we celebrating, who is great in the eyes of the church that the church is deemed to put on the calendar for us to commemorate week in and week out. Because, of course, there's thousands, millions of saints, potentially billions of saints, and we can only keep so many on the 365-day calendar. So the church has to kind of decide who's best for that, and, it'd be nice if we knew who they are, knew a bit about their story. So what we're doing today is that I'm going to be presenting Saints of the Week, this time for everybody, not just for people who follow us on Locals. So if you're a Locals follower, this will be very, very familiar to you. If not, welcome. Hope you do follow us. And this is just kind of one bit of the perks, I guess, that you can the perks that you can get by following us on Locals. That is, again, at tttdc.locals.com. tttdc.locals.com. Now, without further ado, we got quite a few saints coming up this week, so let's dive right in. So the first saints that we have is actually a joint feast day. For those of you who were at church yesterday, that was June the 29th, 2025. This, of course, is the week from June 29th until July 5th. So those of you who were at church yesterday, you are probably familiar with the great feast day of Saints Peter and Paul that we celebrated. So Peter and Paul probably don't need a whole lot of introduction. They're, just the most important apostles in the history of the church. Starting with Saint Peter, we know from scripture that he was born with the name Simon, and he was son of a man named Jonah, his brother being Andrew. And, the two of them were just humble fishermen up, around the Sea of Galilee, until, Andrew was a follower of John the Baptist and, kind of met Jesus kind of through that when, John baptized Jesus, and then Simon later became part of that following when there's that great event where Simon and Andrew and James and John, sons of Zebedee, are trying to fish, and they're fishing all night and they can't come up with anything. Then finally Jesus shows up. He tells them to cast their net over, which they reluctantly do, and then suddenly the net is brimming with fish. So it's this great miracle of catching fish. Of course, Christ declares that they'll become fishers of men. And Saint Peter declares, "Depart from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." So they accompany Jesus on his public ministry, and it's Simon Peter who makes that great declaration that Jesus is the Christ. These people say all these different things about him, but he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And this is, of course, when Jesus officially gives him the name Peter. Changes it from Simon to Peter, or Cephas, as the Aramaic renders it, and also that's the way St. Paul refers to him, just means rock. And then, of course, he is the rock. Based on that, he is the rock on which the church is built. He becomes the first pope, in that moment. So, Peter throughout the Gospels is known as kind of being very bold, very rash. He's quick to speak, sometimes imprudently. When Jesus was arrested, he was the one who took a sword and cut off the ear of the high priest's slave, the man named Malchus. And then also, he's the one who famously denied Jesus 3 times when Jesus was, arrested and brought to Caiaphas. So, after Christ was raised from the dead, Christ commissions him to kind of tend his sheep, feed his flock, lead his people after he ascends into heaven. And, we see in Acts of the Apostles that with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, Peter becomes a fully changed man and just radicalized in the way that he that he approaches things. He takes that lead role. He's the one who leads all the early preaching of the church. He's there at Pentecost preaching to the masses. He's the one who receives that revelation that it's now okay to eat, unclean foods, kind of that stipulation in the Mosaic law that some foods were considered unclean and could not be eaten. There's that famous scene when Peter sees the vision, rise Peter, kill and eat. And then, through that, the Gentiles are able to kind of enter the new covenant without needing to stick with the stipulations of the old covenant. He's also the presider at the Council of Jerusalem, which officially kind of declares that Gentiles do not need to be circumcised to become Christians. And after the Council of Jerusalem, Peter kind of falls out of the narrative of Acts of the Apostles a bit, as it kind of focuses more on Paul for the remainder of the book. However, we know, from history and from church history that at some point, maybe possibly in the late 40s, early 50s, Peter found his way to Rome by way of Antioch, and then kind of became the head of the church that that was kind of burgeoning in that city. He was definitely there by the 60s because that's when we know that in the year around the year AD 64, during Nero's famous persecutions of the church, he is martyred, and he's martyred upside down, as we're told by church history, because he didn't consider himself worthy enough to be crucified in the same way Christ was. So he was crucified upside down, and that's kind of why the one of the symbols of the Pope is actually the upside down cross. So next time you see a bunch of black metal Satanists trying to be edgy and by using an upside down cross, just remember that the actual upside down cross is the cross of St. Peter. So they don't even notice it, but they are using a symbol of the Pope in their edgy little Satanist world or whatever the heck. So that's St. Peter. St. Paul, again, also celebrated on the same day, as they were both very instrumental in the formation of the Roman Church. So from the very earliest days, their feast days have been kind of joined together in this. Paul was born Saul of Tarsus. He was born a Roman citizen, also a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin. And in his early days, he studied under the famed Rabbi Gamaliel. And by trade, he was actually a tent maker. We know this from Acts of the Apostles, when he's staying with Aquila and Priscilla, who were very close friends and co-workers of his in his ministry. It mentions that he was of the same trade of them, and then mentions that their trade is that of a tent maker. So he was a devout Jew, and he was very highly skeptical of this new Christian movement, these new followers of this Jesus guy that were kind of propping up. And he was so devout that he thought that since he considered them blaspheming by equating Christ to God, he began persecuting them and killing members of that community. He was presiding at the stoning of Saint Stephen, the first martyr of the church. And it was sometime after this, Saul was on the road to go to Damascus, where a bunch of Christians lived, and he wanted to kind of go there and arrest them and put them in prison. It was while he was on the road there that he was struck blind and kind of thrown to the ground by this kind of great vision. And then he actually saw the risen Jesus appear to him, and said that famous line, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And then he was kind of told to go into the city to meet a man, and be instructed in the faith and to receive his sight back. So just completely flabbergasted by this event. Saul does go into the city, meets the man, and is baptized, and becomes from that day forward a staunch Christian, a staunch believer in the truth of Christ and his divinity, and just in the faith. So as he does this, he is partnered in his early days with Saint Barnabas, who we discussed a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of the apostles, when Saul first arrived in Jerusalem, they were understandably, a little skeptical. This is that Saul guy who was trying to kill us all. How can we trust him? But Barnabas vouched for him, and then, by his actions, Saul, who started to go by his Roman name, Paul, became somebody who they realized they could trust, and that was a truly changed man and a staunch defender of the faith. So Paul and Barnabas went around Asia Minor and Syria and all those regions. The first journey, they went from Antioch to Cyprus and eventually to Asia Minor. They returned to Antioch after this, during the time that the Judaizer controversy was starting to heat up very much in that city. And then they are the ones who actually were sent by the church in Antioch to Jerusalem to kind of settle the question. And so they kind of brought about the Great Council of Jerusalem that St. Peter presided at. After the council, Paul continued to preach. However, him and Barnabas had a bit of a falling out, so they kind of went their separate ways. Barnabas took Mark, went to Cyprus, while Paul took some of his followers like Silvanus and Luke, and they traveled to Europe. So he became kind of the first recorded apostle to Europe itself, to Greece. So when he returned to Jerusalem after his third journey, he narrowly escaped a plot to kill him by the Jews. The Jews were very incensed by his preaching, so they wanted to kind of arrest him and kill him. However, at this time, of course, Rome was in charge, so he was kept in Roman custody. first under a man, the governor Antonius Felix, and then later under the governor Porcius Festus. It was during this time that he appealed to Caesar. As a Roman citizen, he had a right to appeal his case before Caesar himself, so he utilized that right, and then was kind of sent under guard, under house arrest to Rome itself. And of course, during this event that he shipwrecked in Malta. Eventually he does make it to Rome, probably around the early 60s, 61, 62, somewhere in there. And he's present in Rome during Nero's persecutions. So during the time when Peter would have been crucified upside down, as we mentioned. And then also Paul himself would have been martyred by beheading sometime in the late 60s, maybe around 67-ish. And then, of course, a large part of what we know from the New Testament comes from St. Paul. So he was a very prolific writer, wrote letters to all these different communities that he established all over the world. And along with Peter, kind of were the two men who really worked tirelessly to establish the church and make it what it is today. So we celebrate them both on the same day, that being June 29th, the feasts of Saints Peter and Paul. Now, the next saints that we have is kind of a group of people, that being the first martyrs of the church in Rome. So we discussed Nero's persecution with Saints Peter and Paul. So these martyrs would have been the martyrs who were all persecuted and then killed during this persecution. So those that we don't have recorded in history, other than Saints Peter and Paul, they would be considered, celebrated on this feast day. So just to give a bit of background into what we've already discussed. Christians came to Rome at some time, at some point after the resurrection. Peter possibly would have come, as we mentioned, sometime around late 40s or 50, or, late 40s, early 50s AD. There was definitely a large Jewish population in Rome just from, centuries before. We know that they were expelled by the Emperor Claudius around the year 4950 when he ruled the empire. And the Roman historian Suetonius discusses this expulsion, and the reason he gives for why the Jews were expelled is because there was a certain disagreement about a man named Christ, which kind of indicates that the issues that were going on were between the different Jewish factions at the time, one being the Jewish Christians and the others being just, the regular Jews who didn't believe in, Christ's message and his divinity. So Acts 18 mentions this persecution in that Aquila and Priscilla are both Jews, both these two co-workers of Paul. And it's mentioned they left Rome because of a great persecution. So it most likely would have been because of this persecution of Claudius. However, the Jews probably returned to Rome sometime after Claudius's death. Things kind of cooled off a bit after the emperor had passed. And we know this because Paul wrote the letter to the Romans probably sometimes in the late 50s. And during this time, it was clear that there were still sort of different factions with Jews and Christians in Rome, so some of them most likely would have returned. Paul hadn't been to Rome yet at this point when he wrote Romans. He arrived in Rome. Paul would have arrived in Rome sometime after, appealing to Caesar. So again, as we mentioned, around 60, 62. The Great Fire of Rome occurred in July of the year 64. And then this was one of the events that, a lot of people would tell rumors that, this fire was actually started by Nero because he wanted to kind of clear that area to build a great palace of his. And that's kind of the district where he wanted the palace to be. But either way, the Roman historian Tacitus mentions that the Christians were kind of blamed for this and put to death around this time. He says that they were put to death because of their, quote, hatred for the human race. So no matter what it was, whether it was the fire or something else, people in Rome were very incensed at Christians around this time, and Nero kind of spearheaded leading this great kind of crusade against them, this crucifixions and persecutions. Peter and Paul being among the victims, and then of course many other martyrs whose names may be lost to history, but of course aren't lost to God, and they would be the first martyrs of the church in Rome who survived this persecution. Persecution, fortunately, did come to an end in the year 68 when Nero killed himself, and then his reign as emperor ended. So we celebrate the first martyrs of the Church of Rome on June the 30th. Now, the next saint we have is on July the 1st, and that is Saint Junípero Serra. So Saint Junípero Serra was born on the 24th of November in the year 1713 at the town of Petra, which is on the island of Majorca in modern-day Spain. His parents were Antonio Nadal Serra and Margarita Rosa Ferrer. They were both very humble farmers from very simple backgrounds. Junípero was actually given the baptismal name Miguel Jose. This was actually his birth name. He studied at a school run by the Franciscans, so from a very early age, he started to have an interest in the Franciscan order. At age 15, he was sent to the city of Palma by his parents to kind of study with the canons of the cathedral there. And then he kind of began to assist in some philosophy classes at the monastery of San Francisco in this city. And, he was known as kind of a very short man, even for the standards of that day, kind of standing about, at like 5'2". Also he was known for his very deep and kind of very commanding voice. In the year 1730, he became a novice at the Convento de Jesus, which it was here that he made his profession as a Franciscan in September 15th of this year. He chose the name Junípero at this time in memory of a companion of St. Francis. In the year 1738 or thereabouts, it's likely when he was ordained officially as a priest. And then he obtained a doctorate in theology in 1742. And, he taught and preached for several years before deciding in 1749 that a missionary life is what he felt called to. So in 1749, him and a fellow Franciscan of his, a man named Francisco Palu, they sailed for Veracruz in the colony of New Spain, which, modern days is part of Mexico. And, when they arrived here, they were supplied with horses to make the trip from Veracruz to Mexico City, which is further inland. However, the two friars decided that they would walk the full 250 miles. So kind of shows you the tenacity of them and the kind of penitential spirit that they kind of brought to their lives. They helped set up a mission at the town of Sierra Gorda, which they stayed at between 1750 and 1758. This is kind of one of the missions that were set up over the different Spanish colonies of the New World around this time. So just to give a kind of a brief intro on the mission system. So basically the idea was, right, the Spanish were here and there was all these natives who weren't really too familiar with Christianity. And, of course the Spanish wanted to evangelize them, wanted to kind of induct them into the faith and also induct them into Spanish society. So the mission system was kind of something that the church sponsored, where you would have different orders, like sometimes you'd run by the Jesuits, commonly by the Franciscans, who would kind of run this small community kind of built around a church and small monastery, and then the natives would live there, kind of work the land, be instructed in the faith, and then the idea in many of the cases was kind of that after some time, a generation or two, when the community was able to kind of support itself, then the land of the mission would kind of be turned back to them, and then they would be able to work it. Didn't necessarily work that way in practice. We'll get into some of that a little later, but that was kind of the idea of what the Spanish mission system was. St. Junípero Serra worked, as we mentioned, at the mission of Sierra Gorda. This is the first one he worked at in Mexico. He oversaw during his time there, he oversaw the construction of a larger church, and also kind of helped develop the mission. He learned the Otomi language, which is kind of the language of the natives of that area, so that, kind of really helped him be more successful in his preaching, kind of able to reach them at a more intimate level. He was known as a staunch advocate for the natives against intrusions from Spanish settlers. This is another theme that would kind of come up a lot in his life, was that, he had a very deep love for the people that he served, for these native people. And, while instructing them in the faith and, in Spanish and in that culture, he also had a deep respect for their own culture and kind of wanting to keep the Spanish from, unfairly treating them or treating them like lesser. So St. Junípero worked as a day laborer during his time at these missions. And, from about the year 1758 to 1767, he continued to work at different missions throughout Mexico, as he was transferred around. In 1768, there was a call that went out for volunteers to establish missions in Upper California. So, of course, at this time, New Spain included a lot of what we would consider the American West, the American Southwest. So California was actually two separate provinces, one being Upper California, which is, the entire state of California as we know it today, and then also Baja California, which is the part that's currently still part of Mexico, kind of the peninsula down in the south. So you had Upper California and Lower California, Alta and Baja California. And they wanted to start establishing some more missions in Upper California, Alta California. So St. Junípero, he was very enthusiastic about wanting to do this mission. So the first place that they set off from was actually in Baja California itself, where they founded the mission at San Fernando de Velacata. So this is kind of the only mission in, I believe, Baja California that was founded by the Franciscans. So they started there and then continued into the north. The trip was very difficult for Junípero because, his health wasn't as great as it had been in his younger years. He was always known for having a very good constitution. However, as he aged, he came down with asthma. He would get a lot of mosquito bites on his legs, which would kind of make them swell up. So he had trouble getting around. However, he worked through it because he really wanted to go on this journey to minister to these people. And over the course of the next couple of decades, he founded 9 missions in California, in the modern state of California. Out of the 21 Spanish missions in California that we have today, 9 of the first 9 were established by Saint Junípero himself and his Franciscan brothers. So the first mission he founded was Mission San Diego de Alcala, which became the modern city of San Diego. He founded this on the 16th of July, 1769. The second mission was San Carlos Borromeo de Carmelo, which is in the current town of Carmel by the Sea. They established this on June the 3rd, 1770. The next mission was Mission San Antonio de Padua, which they founded in Jolon, California on July 14th, 1771. Next was Mission San Gabriel Arcangel, which is in the city of San Gabriel on September 8th, 1771. Next was the Mission San Luis Obispo de Tolosa, which is in San Luis Obispo of California. They established this on the 1st of September, 1772. Next was San Francisco de Assisi, which became the modern city of San Francisco. They founded this on October 9th, 1776. Next was Mission San Juan Capistrano in San Juan Capistrano, California, which they established on November 1st, 1776. Next was Mission Santa Clara de Assisi, which they founded in Santa Clara on the 12th of January, 1777. And finally, the final mission, which St. Junípero helped found, was Mission Santa Buenaventura, which is in the modern city of Ventura on March 31st, 1782. And throughout this time, the headquarters of St. Junípero's mission was at Mission San Carlos in Carmel. He died on the 28th of August in 1784 at age 70 at Mission San Carlos. And he's buried actually in the floor of the sanctuary. I've actually been there. I was in California a couple months ago, and I didn't really have much of a plan. So at some point I got there and decided, hey, why don't I try to see some of the missions that are here? So I saw Mission Santa Barbara, and then I was in Carmel, so I went to Mission San Carlos, and I'm literally in the church itself, and I look down and I'm like, oh, that's Saint Junípero Serra. Literally right there in the sanctuary, there's his little tombstone, a picture of him, and it was just a really awesome experience for me because I've never actually been, at least that I know of, been at a site of a saint's, at a saint's tomb. I've never gotten to pray at a saint's tomb, so that was kind of the first time being able to experience that. So that was really cool to see that. But anyway, so he was buried here, and so Saint Junípero was just always known for his great love of his natives, as we mentioned. Trying to protect them from government excesses, which, not to get political, but a couple of years ago, there was a lot of controversy going around where different riots and protests and things like that, and kind of a lot of discussion in the media about colonization and slavery and natives and different things like that. And I remember a lot of people were kind of going after statues of Saint Junípero Serra in California and stuff because he was the one who helped create this mission system that was kind of very abusive towards the natives. And it's kind of frustrating if you know anything about his history, because he worked so hard to treat these people so well, and he loved them so much and just wanted to bring the truth of the gospel to them. So to kind of lump him in with people who abused them or did excesses or went after them, it's just so unfair to his legacy. And another thing about the mission system that I think is a bit unfortunate is, I mentioned that kind of the idea was, right, that they would kind of teach the native Spanish, kind of teach them Spanish culture, teach them Catholicism, and then also kind of teach them how to kind of work the lands and, different things like this. And then eventually the idea would be that they'd be able to turn that land back over to the natives, after a couple of generations, as, that was their land to obviously live on. However, in a lot of cases, this never really got to come to fruition. A bit of Mexican history, we discussed some bits of Mexican history a couple weeks ago when we were talking about the Cristera War. But after Mexico declared independence from Spain in the 1820s, there was a lot of controversy just between the role of the church in the state and kind of the power of the church, and some people saw that as like the last vestiges of the royal Spanish, and they wanted to get away from that and kind of establish their own Mexican authority, things like that. So there was a lot of kind of, the church should be kind of persecuted, then it might get more favor, and there was a lot of kind of ebb and flow in that. So unfortunately, the mission system kind of got caught up in the middle of this. A lot of these missions, as we mentioned, were founded from 1769 to 1782. So a generation or two later would have been around the 1820s. So as the government kind of started taking over some of the church property, a lot of the missions were seized by the government. So they never really got to kind of get back to the natives in that way because the government kind of interrupted the plan. And then, of course, once California became a U.S. state, a lot of the same things. The government still owned a lot of this land. It wasn't actually until the 1860s that Abraham Lincoln actually gave most of the missions back to the Catholic Church to run. And then, eventually they just became parish churches in and of themselves. But the legacy of the mission system is a bit fraught in the fact that in many ways it was frustrated, I think. I think there was a lot of good intentions there. But especially, from Junípero Serra himself, but, politics being what it is, fickle human nature being what it is, a lot of it kind of turned around and kind of ended up being more harm than good for some of the natives. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's a bit of a historical tangent. St. Junípero Serra was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1988, and then finally canonized by Pope Francis in Washington, D.C. when he visited the U.S. in 2015. And as we mentioned, his feast day is on July the 1st. So the next saint that we have, another biblical saint, is St. Thomas the Apostle. Now, we don't actually know a whole lot about St. Thomas. The information about him in the Gospels is very slim. He's, of course, mentioned in all the Gospels as one of the 12 disciples, 12 apostles of Christ. He's also mentions in the Gospel of John that he's given the name Didymus, which means twin, so that leads some people to suggest that, maybe he had like a twin sibling or something like that. We don't know. It doesn't really elaborate. But we do know that kind of one of the most famous instances of St. Thomas is that he was not present in the upper room on Easter Sunday evening when Jesus first appeared to the apostles after being raised to the dead, right? So there's that scene where Jesus appears in their midst, says, "Peace be with you." They think he's a ghost, but it becomes very obvious that he is actually not a ghost and he is there physically with them. Of course, Thomas is out at this point. They speak to him later and try to tell them, like, "You're never going to believe what happened." And Thomas is like, "You're right. I don't believe what happened. There's no way he could have appeared." And of course he makes that famous statement that unless he can, put his fingers through the nail marks and then put his, hands into the wound on Jesus' side, he's not going to believe that he actually appeared. He actually rose from the dead. Now, of course, the next week they're in the room again. Thomas is with them. Jesus appears to them and, asks Thomas, put your fingers into the nail marks, put your hand into my side and see that I'm actually here in the flesh. And, of course, in this, Thomas gives that great declaration, my Lord and my God. He is so ecstatic to see Jesus raised from the dead. So this is the last appearance of Thomas in Scripture. Tradition holds that after this, he was an apostle to India. So he actually went east after the apostles kind of split out after Pentecost. And of course, this is the ancient historical account of the Indian Christians known as the St. Thomas Christians. And tradition continues by saying that some of his relics returned to Edessa in modern day Turkey after his death, where they were around the times of the Crusades. And that's kind of all we have about St. Thomas. As I said, not a figure we actually know a whole lot about, but at the same time, a very important saint in the history of our tradition. And we celebrate him on July the 3rd. Now, next saint we have is for July the 5th, is St. Anthony Mary Zaccaria. So, St. Anthony was born in December of 1502 in Cremona in the Duchy of Milan. So, his father died when he was 2 years old, so he was raised primarily by his mother, Antonia Pescaroli Zaccaria. She was a very devout woman who worked very hard to raise him in the faith. He studied medicine at the University of Padua, completing his studies in 1524 at the age of 22. Anthony then practiced medicine for about 3 years until he decided that the priesthood was his calling, and he started studying, for that in 1527. In 1529, he was ordained to the priesthood, and, with his medical background, worked very closely with hospitals and also just worked kind of serving the poor, had a very great love for the poor. He became a spiritual director to Countess Ludovica Torelli of Guastalla, which was kind of a county in northern Italy at this time. And, through this, he journeyed to Milan. He joined what was known as the Oratory of Eternal Wisdom, which was something that the Countess was also a part of. She was a very devout woman in her own right. Anthony began devotions focusing on the teachings of St. Paul and just also his great love for the Eucharist. And Anthony began to gain a following kind of in his disciplines of this. He provided catechesis, he gave parish missions, he cared for the sick, and also brought about the return of a tradition that had kind of fallen by the wayside in this time to ring all of the church bells in the city at 3 p.m. on Fridays, of course, in commemoration of the time Jesus would have died. Pope Clement the Seventh was highly supportive of Anthony's endeavors and kind of encouraged him to expand his ministry. So Anthony obtained a house in 1533 to begin kind of a community life, kind of started living in community with a group of other, like-minded brothers. They became known as the Barnabites after, St. Barnabas, the great companion of St. Paul. And he was a great advocate for the 40 hours devotion. A lot of churches kind of do that devotion where, you have 40 hours of Eucharistic adoration. So you can kind of come in as you do. There's preaching, teaching Mass, of course. And St. Anthony opened a second house in 1537. So kind of his movement was starting to spread a bit. While he was in Guastalla in 1539 doing a parish mission, he actually caught a fever, which took his life on the 5th of July of that same year. He was only 36 years old at this time. And he was during his life, able to found 3 different religious orders, including kind of the Clerus Regular of St. Paul, known as the Barnabites that we discussed, that he, started establishing communities for. He also started a community for women known as the Angelic Sisters of St. Paul. And then finally, he started a group for lay married individuals, actually known as the Laity of St. Paul. So, just somebody who had a great love for St. Paul and kind of wanting to kind of spread his message and then create communities for these different groups to be able to engage in that lifestyle. So his body was declared incorrupt 27 years after his death, and it's currently enshrined at the Church of St. Barnabas in Milan, Italy. And he was canonized by Pope Leo XIII in 1897. So the final saint that we have today is St. Elizabeth of Portugal, feast day of July 5th, which we have a caveat we'll get back to in a second. St. Elizabeth was born on the 4th of January in the year 1271 in Zaragoza, which at that point was the capital of the Kingdom of Aragon. So she was born into a very royal family. Her father was Peter, who was the Infante, kind of the crown prince of Aragon at that time, later ascended to the throne as King Peter III. And his mother was Constance of Sicily, who later, of course, became Queen of Aragon, but also Queen of Sicily, because King Peter ruled both Sicily and Aragon around this time. So she was born to 2 noble parents. She was the sister of 3 different kings of Aragon and Sicily. So her one brother, Alfonso, became Alfonso III of Aragon. Another brother she had named James was James II of Aragon. And finally, her brother Frederick became Frederick III of Sicily. And she was also named for a great aunt, St. Elizabeth of Hungary. So as you can see, very powerful family here. We have multiple kings of Aragon and Sicily, and then also a great saint was her great aunt. So a really great pedigree. She was a very pious, Elizabeth was a very pious child. She did the divine office daily. She fasted and also participated in other penances. So she was just very disciplined from a very early age. She was actually betrothed to King Denis of Portugal when King Denis, who at this time was 20 years old, in 1282 when she was engaged. She was actually only around 11 or 12 at this time. So she was very young when she was kind of betrothed to him. However, they weren't officially married until much later. So 1288 is when they got married. Denis was now 26 and she was 17. So just to kind of show you kind of what was kind of being traded around this time in the noble circles of Spain. You think wedding dowry, you think like gold, jewels, this type of thing. Her dowry included 3 towns, which Denis was kind of given control of in Portugal from the Kingdom of Aragon. The towns of Obidos, Abrantes, and Porto de Mos were transferred to Portugal as a wedding present for the marriage between Denis and Elizabeth. So now that she was queen, Elizabeth, served with her husband. Her husband, Denis, was known as the Poet King, and also known to have a great love of farming and agriculture. There's actually a forest near Leiria in Portugal, which he himself had planted in order to kind of prevent soil degradation. And this forest still exists. So because of this, he was just known for his agricultural prowess. And also, Denis was known as kind of a great reformer of the Portuguese state. Generally, there was a large period of peace during his reign. So this kind of helped him kind of establish some of the law apparatus and some of the different internal structures of the government to kind of solidify the king's rule over the country. So Elizabeth, during her time as queen, was very devoted to the poor and sick around the kingdom, became very well known for her charity to both strangers and pilgrim alike. She was devoted to her husband, Dennis, who she, served and loved very much, even despite the fact that he lived a very scandalous lifestyle in that he had a mistress and he was very, his infidelities were great. He wasn't very great to her and very respectful of their marriage. But despite this, she was ever a peacemaker and ever a diplomat and tried to kind of, keep things, keep the peace within the kingdom. One example of this is that she helped to negotiate peace treaties between Dennis and several of the other kings in the area, including the King of Castile and some of the other kingdoms, around Spain. She had 2 children, a daughter named Constance, who married the King of Castile, and then also Alfonso, who later became King Alfonso IV of Portugal. So Alfonso and his father actually got into, a bit of disagreements as the years went on, because Alfonso was, of course, the heir, the rightly born heir of the crown. However, his father's favorite child was, actually, a different Alfonso Sanchez, who was the son of one of Dennis's mistresses. So, of course, the father favored the illegitimate son over his actual kind of official son, and Alfonso didn't really appreciate this. So this kind of came to a head around the year 1322 when that a big war erupted over this between Alfonso and Dennis. So for about 2 years, they kind of were kind of at war with each other. However, Elizabeth, kind of wanting to bring peace between her husband and her son, kind of negotiated a peace, brought about some reconciliation there. There's actually a story that there was this one battle that was about to start between son and father at Alvalante, which is in Portugal. However, Elizabeth rode in on a mule and kind of rode right up into the middle of the 2 armies that are about to go to war, and was able to kind of get them to stop and take a moment and just kind of talk things out. And through this, they were able to kind of stop that fighting, stop that battle from breaking out. So eventually, this kind of controversy came to an end where Alfonso Sanchez, the illegitimate son, was sent into exile, and then Alfonso kind of confirmed in his role as the heir and primary son. King Dennis died the next year in 1325 at Santarém, which is also a famous site of a 13th century Eucharistic miracle, famous Portuguese Eucharistic miracle. After her husband died, Elizabeth kind of retired to a monastery of the Poor Clares, which was called the Monastery of Santa Clara a Vela, which she actually helped found in the year 1314, so about 10 or so years before. She helped found this monastery, and then that's where she ended up retiring. She became a Third Order Franciscan, and just kind of spent the rest of her life serving the poor. She was, of course, just continued to be known for great modesty, great humility. In the year 1336, she was brought back to politics in that her son, who is now the King Alfonso IV in his own right, went to war with a nephew of a third Alfonso IX of Castile. There was a lot of Alfonsos in Spanish history. So Alfonso IV of Portugal went to war with Alfonso IX of Castile. And the reason for this war was actually because Alfonso IV had married his daughter Maria to Alfonso IX. And there was a lot of allegations around that time that Alfonso was not treating Maria very well. He had mistresses. He kind of ignored his true wife and kind of had all of his children by his mistress. And just was not treating his wife in any way that you should treat your wife. So, of course, war is never a good thing, but honestly, kind of based for Alfonso IV for going to war to protect the honor of his daughter. Kind of respect that in a way. However, of course, this is war, and a lot of men are dying over this dispute that should be resolved kind of in a more amicable, more peaceful way. So Elizabeth, kind of wanting to bring this peace about, was kind of brought to the site of the 2 armies as quickly as possible, and she was able to bring about a peace settlement in this conflict. However, after this, she became very ill on her way home and ended up dying soon after. And she ended up dying actually on the 4th of July in the year 1336. And she was born at the convent of Santa Clara in Coimbra, Portugal. And in the 17th century, she was actually moved to the monastery of Santa Clara a Nova, also in Coimbra. She was beatified in 1516 by Pope Leo X, and then canonized in 1626 by Pope Urban VIII. So I mentioned that I'd get back to her feast day. Her feast day is actually on July 4th. So that was the day of her death. So that was her official feast day. It was moved to July 8th in the year 1694 by Pope Innocent XII. So it wouldn't affect the octaves of Saints Peter and Paul. Obviously, we talked about them way back when. That used to be a full 8-day octave that you would celebrate for that feast. However, this octave was actually abolished by Pope Pius XII in 1955. And then the feast of St. Elizabeth of Portugal was moved back to July 4th in 1969 with the origin of the new calendar. However, in the United States, it's actually transferred to July 5th, since on July 4th, I guess apparently we're too busy celebrating the solemnity of the Declaration of Independence or something like that. So we can't be bothered to have a feast day on that day. But be that as it may, in the United States, which is where I am, and which is the specific calendar that I'm going off of, her feast day is on July the 5th. So that's all we have for today. This was probably the longest edition of this that I've done. So you're welcome. We hope to see you again soon for our next episode. If you liked what you saw here, I do this every week on Locals, so please check us out, tttdc.locals.com, tango, 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 delta, charlie.locals.com. Next week, hopefully, we'll probably be back in our normal capacity. But until then, I hope you all have a blessed week, and God bless.